players should you add before week 9 of the fantasy football season? What's going on, fantasy freaks and football fans? It's Mitch here, back with another week of my must-adds. 10 players that you should add before week 9. We're getting closer. We're inching closer. Trade deadlines are coming up in your leagues. So you have to think about the depth of your roster, potentially putting together and piecing together some trades to stockpile for the playoffs. You're also thinking about depth and players that have to fill in for bye weeks. And you're just trying to maximize your overall talent for the rest of the season. So no more hanging on to a desperate potential that has not existed. We're trying to have the best possible roster without flaws. So let's get started. Gronk, spike the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to OwnersBox Fantasy for weekly must-add videos every single week of the fantasy football season. If you guys would like to see any other kind of content here on OwnersBox Fantasy when it comes to fantasy football, comment in the comment section below. We would love to hear from you guys. Let's get started with a quick mention of a player that I feel like I've discussed every single week of the NFL season since the season began, even before the season began, all the way to early August. Tyrone Tracy, if he is not on a roster because he's like fringe 51, 52% owned in Yahoo leagues, he's not exactly a highly owned player. If he is not owned in your league, call out the rest of the jabronis. Pick him up, bro. Like, what are you doing at this point? Tyrone Tracy on Monday Night Football just put on a show against arguably the best defense in all of football on the road in Pittsburgh. He had 7.3 yards per carry, 145 rushing yards on 20 attempts, and a long rushing touchdown against TJ Watt, Cam Hayward, Alex Highsmith, Pat Queen, the whole Steeler defense. So for whatever reason, if he is not added, please add him. Didn't even need to add that to the video, but bro, like seriously, I just need to bring it up. Our first real must-add of week number 9 is Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, and he's going to kick off a long section of this video, which is going to discuss wide receivers, because this week is all about wide receivers. Especially at this point in the season, you're probably playing in a league with at least 3 startable receivers, maybe 4, right? Including the flex spots. So you're going to need bye week fills, and you're also going to need depth at this position. Cedric Tillman is a player that feels like a flex for the rest of the year as long as Jamus Winston is the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. He looks extremely impressive as a second-year receiver with a big frame, physical player that can catch over the middle of the field, can line up as that X receiver in the offense, replace Amari Cooper, and pretty much has become that type of player in this offense. Like, he has a pretty good intermediate route tree. He understands how to take contact. He understands how to just body people out, catch the football in traffic. He's not the most gifted in terms of speed or athleticism overall, but man, the kid is big. Like, second-year receiver, young, but like big frame, big bodied player, just thick receiver. He's one of those, like the Michael Thomas frame. That's the type of frame this Cedric Tillman has. And 26 targets, 18 receptions, 189 yards, and 2 touchdowns so far this year. But you look at the last 2 weeks with Jamus, 7 receptions, 99 yards versus Baltimore. He also had 8 catches, 81 yards versus Cincinnati. That's 15 catches and nearly 200 yards in 2 weeks. So I think he's for real. Pick him up. He's definitely, in my opinion, the number 1 add. The guy that I can easily see being a startable level player for the rest of the year at wide receiver. Probably a wide receiver 3 or a flex. If you get anything better than that at this point in the season, that's phenomenal. But Jamus Winston, we know he's going to sling it. We know he's going to throw the ball down the field. And the interesting thing about Jamus, we're going to bring him up later in this video, He threw the ball 41 times, which is an indication of how Cleveland wants to play offensively. Tillman is a big part of that. A player that is becoming a big part of an offense for the rest of the year is Keon Coleman in Buffalo. Keon Coleman started the season a little rocky, a little up and down, didn't really appear to be translating to the NFL at the level that some people would have expected. I wasn't the biggest fan of Keon Coleman in the draft process, I'm going to be honest. I didn't really feel like he was a first-round pick. I thought he was more of a second-round pick, in my opinion. But recently, he's proven me wrong. He really has showed out in his greatest skill, which is contested catches. The last 2 weeks, he put up 4 catches for 125 yards against Tennessee, 5 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown against Seattle. And he did plenty of that against a good corner in Reek Woolen. And Tennessee has a good defense. So I don't necessarily feel like these are fluke performances. I think he's building confidence. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that these happened exactly after Amari Cooper joined the team, because Amari Cooper has added less attention to Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman's getting better matchups. Keon Coleman's running a more suited route tree for his skill set. And he is a dynamic weapon down the field. He's averaging over 18 yards per catch. He's a red zone weapon. He's one of the better contested catchers I've seen pretty much all year. That's a true skill that he had in college that I think is translated to the NFL. And Josh Allen just seems to have a rapport and an understanding with him and a chemistry that's building. And he really trusts him. I mean, you look at 7 targets in the last 2 games, both 7 targets in each game. If that continues, this is a dynamic big play player that's definitely worth a flex play because of the explosive weeks he may have in this awesome offense in Buffalo. So Keon Coleman, my second favorite wide receiver pickup of week 9. Ricky Pearsall would be my third favorite pickup. Ricky Pearsall played quite a bit for San Francisco this past week. He had 4 catches for 38 yards and 4 targets, including an attempt on the ground, a wide receiver reverse, for a 39-yard gain. Ricky Pearsall, if you guys don't know for some reason, living under a rock, was actually shot this offseason, okay? So he has been working back, and this was only his second game as a NFL receiver. And he had to step into a big role, having to replace Brandon Ayuk, with also Jawan Jennings being out of the Niners lineup. Now, what I think ruins some of the steam for Ricky is that Jawan Jennings will largely be the X receiver of this offense, in my opinion, replacing Chris Connolly, who played a ton of snaps against Dallas kind of unnecessarily because they needed a body to throw out there. I think that Jawan Jennings is going to replace Chris Connolly. I think Ricky Pearsall is pretty much going to play that slot role or the Z role pretty exclusively. I think Debo is obviously going to be out there a ton, but with how Debo plays, how explosive he is, the fact that he plays a little bit of running back, a little bit of receiver, which when McCaffrey comes back, he'll probably be playing more receiver just in general, but he's a guy that's banged up a little bit sometimes. He's a guy that's in and out of the lineup sometimes because he's usually getting highly impactful plays where he's taking on multiple defenders, having to go through multiple tackles. You know, he's just a physical player. He's not always on the field as much as other elite players in the NFL at wide receiver. So Ricky will still see plenty of time if Jawan Jennings just basically replaces Chris Connolly. So I would expect Pearsall to still get a lot of targets in that middle of the field. Brock Purdy and Pearsall seem to have a little bit of a rapport working over the middle of the field. And I think he's actually somebody that could really be a breath of fresh air for the 49ers. He's a really tough middle of the field player. He's a really quick route runner. And he just understands for a young player the nuances of route running, breaking off his routes, and being able to separate at the top of his route. He's also deceptively fast, and I would say, like, has all the tools to be an excellent player at the NFL level. I loved him. We talked about him last week. I really liked him in the draft process. He actually had very similar measurables to Julian Edelman coming out of the draft class, including his 3-cone time, which was extraordinary. So he actually does have a lot of really good slot traits. So look for him to continue to work into this offense and just gain more and more rapport and more chemistry with Brock Purdy. He's somebody that I think you stash, you pick up for promise maybe down the stretch, but I don't necessarily think he's a startable player right away like Coleman or Tillman are. Josh Downs is next up. Josh Downs may have been dropped in some of your leagues because of Anthony Richardson and how he's played with and without Joe Flacco. I think there's upside to Josh Downs where if you add him, if Richardson gets hurt again or he just pulls himself from the game because he's too tired, it's entirely possible that Josh Downs just pops off and becomes like a wide receiver 2 caliber player if Joe Flacco's in the game, because that's basically what he's been when Joe Flacco has been playing, because Josh Downs is really, really good. He was Drake May's favorite receiver at North Carolina. He was historic at North Carolina with Drake May. Last season as a rookie showed a lot of promise, and this year, I would argue he's been their best receiver in Indianapolis. A impressive receiving core. Alec Pierce has developed. I would say that Michael Pittman's still a good player, but I mean, Josh Downs, game for game, play for play, pound for pound, probably their best receiver this season. 32 catches, 351 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And he's still a big play player. Like, he's not the fastest guy. He's not the quickest guy. But man, he just knows how to play football. He knows how to run routes. He knows how to be quarterback friendly over the middle of the field. And he has an understanding of how to create big plays. And I think that's definitely suitable for Anthony Richardson over that deep middle of the field where it's easier to complete those passes. But on top of that, I'd also say if Joe Flacco does go in, Josh Downs becomes that much better. So he's another stashable type of player that in a desperation spot or a good matchup, if the Colts are playing a pretty easy secondary or an easy defense, maybe throw him into your flex over these bye week stretches and see what Josh Downs can bring, because he's certainly a very talented football player. It's just an unfortunate situation with the completion percentage and the lack of passing yards and completions from Anthony Richardson right now in Indy. Parker Washington is a player that I would add to this mix this week because Christian Kirk got injured for Jacksonville. And Parker Washington was a very interesting player last year. He replaced Christian Kirk when Kirk went down. And Washington was pretty promising in a few outings last season as their slot player. He's physical. He kind of reminds me, he was a former Penn State player, kind of reminds me of one of those like Chris Godwin light type of players. Like he's got a pretty thick lower base where he's able to take on contact over the middle of the field. He's pretty quick. He's able to break tackles. He's got good side to side, ability. He's not the fastest. He can't really get vertical down the field, but he has a good understanding of working the middle of the field, catching a lot of short passes and converting those into yards after catch. That's the type of player that he is. 6 catches, 67 yards against Green Bay. And I would expect a lot of stat lines like that going forward. So if you're in a PPR league, I think Parker Washington is definitely worth a pickup because replacing Christian Kirk, he's not the same type of player as Kirk. Kirk is more of a vertical slot receiver, while Parker will be more of a short to intermediate player. So look out for Parker Washington. I'd also say just on top of that Evan Ingram becomes that much more interesting. Maybe trade for him or look for him to just perhaps get more targets in this offense because Evan Ingram went off last year when Christian Kirk went down. So just keep that in mind. But Parker Washington is definitely a player worth an addition and seeing how he fits in this offense post Christian Kirk injury. Elijah Moore is the final wide receiver to mention here in this video. With Jamus Winston, Elijah Moore drew a team high 12 targets versus the Ravens, which was also a win, by the way, a shocking victory. He had 8 catches for 85 yards in that game, and he has 126 total yards over the past 2 weeks. Elijah Moore has always been a player that has had upside. People have liked in the fantasy community, the NFL community. He was a former second-round pick, if I'm not mistaken, a highly productive college player, had moments with the Jets early in his career, but has never really found a rhythm or a moment with Cleveland. But I think post Amari Cooper, he's another guy that I would look at. I mean, Jerry Jeudy, I think, is overrated as a player. I don't really see how Elijah Moore can't outproduce him as a yards after catch player, as a short area threat, as somebody that Jameis can rely on to move the chains. And if the Browns are going to be throwing the ball 40 times a game and Elijah Moore is going to be out there in 3 receiver sets, he's going to see plenty of volume as a slot receiver for Jamus Winston. So yeah, Elijah Moore is definitely a pickup. And again, see how this Jamus Winston Browns offense continues to develop. See if he's a consistent player in that offense. Definitely a player to add. Now let's finish off with the quarterbacks and the tight ends. Those are the wide receivers. We've got Cedric Tillman, Keon Coleman, Ricky Pearsall, Josh Downs, Parker Washington, and Elijah Moore. Now, we have 4 players remaining, beginning with Matthew Stafford. for the Los Angeles Rams. I actually brought up Matthew Stafford as a buy low recently, and I think I was right. On Thursday Night Football, had a 4-touchdown game against the Minnesota Vikings. His first game with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua for an entire game, and he put up 4 touchdowns. The interesting thing about that is he had the highest completion percentage of his season, 73+%. He had the most yards that he's thrown for since week 1, and he also had the most passing touchdowns of the season. His only game in which he had more than 1 passing touchdown in a game, 4 against one of the better defenses to start the season, the Minnesota Vikings. Next week, he plays Seattle, which is a pretty easy matchup. I would definitely recommend him if you are a little shaky at quarterback, or maybe you have Brock Purdy on a bye or something like that. Definitely look at Matthew Stafford to pick up in that matchup. He looked great against the Vikings. He was just absolutely on fire. He was honed in on what he had to do, get the ball out quick. The timing, the rhythm of the offense just comes back when Nacua is out there. Nacua is such a good player, and he creates yards after catch. Cooper Kupp is so reliable. Their chemistry is just unbelievable. It's just almost undefendable at times. Despite Kupp kind of slowing down, Stafford and Kupp just have a wicked rapport. So, yeah, Stafford is definitely a startable quarterback in any decent matchup for the rest of the fantasy season when those 2 receivers are on the field. Jamus Winston, we've brought him up multiple times. Winston has always been a friend to fantasy folks. He is just a gunslinger, and those guys are great for fantasy. When we look at Joe Flacco last year, think about Joe Flacco last year. He was actually startable in fantasy. I had him in leagues. He helped me do well in fantasy last year, and Jamus Winston's very much the same. In Cleveland, they're going to run a play action, downfield passing attack, just as Joe Flacco did. And we've seen a difference between the Deshaun Watson offense in Cleveland because he's terrible, and then the Joe Flacco, Jamus Winston offense. It's more willing to throw the ball. It's higher volume passing attempts. It's more downfield strikes. And Jamus Winston had 334 yards and 3 touchdowns against Baltimore. Baltimore is not a great pass defense, but they're definitely a good team. So to put that up in his first game, 41 attempts in his first game, to be trusted to do that in that game, I think speaks volumes. And the game was close throughout the entire day. So it wasn't like they were trailing in the game. They were actually leading for a majority of the game. So Jamus Winston showed out big time at home. Love to see the guy thriving. He is a great dude, just a great guy to cheer for. A lot of fun to watch, and it's nice to see him back on the field, and especially over Deshaun Watson. Cleveland all of a sudden becomes a very fun team to watch with all these players I've mentioned in this video, but it's all because of the switch at quarterback, and Jamus Winston, the gunslinger, definitely worth a pickup for sure. I don't think that the matchup next week is necessarily amazing, but I feel like there will be stretches, there will be games where you definitely want to start Jamus Winston. At tight end, Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If you didn't already pick him up, I think he's definitely worth the pickup now. He's had 17 total receptions in the last 2 games, and he's had 10 targets in the last 2 games. That's 20 combined targets in the last 2 games against Baltimore and against Atlanta. 2 games in which they were trailing and they had to throw the ball. Without Chris Godwin in this last game, without Mike Evans in the Monday Night Football game against the Ravens, he has 51 total targets this season. He has 3 touchdowns, 344 yards. Cade Otton has always been a target volume hog ever since his rookie season with Tom Brady. He seemed to have rapport with an older Tom Brady. He seems to have rapport with Baker Mayfield, and he's actually getting better as a player. And I think what he's doing is he's helping replace the middle of the field offense that Chris Godwin kind of left vacated, because Godwin was so big in the middle of the field. Otton helps replace that. He picks up some of those targets, some of that volume from this offense. So Cade Otton definitely feels like a startable tight end pretty much every week that the Bucs play for the rest of the year without Chris Godwin. Zach Ertz is a sneaky good ad to finish off this video at tight end. He's one of the most consistent tight ends in fantasy. He's actually had 7 out of his 8 games with 4+ targets. And that's exactly what you're looking for in PPR leagues and PPR settings for the tight end position. You're looking for tight ends that get targets, because a lot of them don't. I mean, some people like to rely on touchdowns or players that get more touchdowns at tight end. I'd rather have the targets. I'd rather have a guy that's constantly involved in the offense. Zach Ertz is certainly that. He might be old, he might be slow, but he's still reliable, and Jaden Daniels really trusts him. He has 45 targets, 32 catches on the season for 345 yards. This past week against Chicago, he had 11 targets, 7 catches, 77 yards against one of the better defenses and pass defenses in the NFL. So Zach Ertz can still get it done for your fantasy teams and for real life. The Commanders' offense is one of the best in the league add Zach Ertz. Those are your must-adds of week number 9. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, spike the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to OwnersBox Fantasy for weekly must-add videos, and comment your opinion in the comments section below. It's Mitch. Thank you so much for watching.